Architecture is really the art and science of turning fiction into fact.
Sometimes kind of real architectural life interferes with intellectual architectural life.
There is no such thing as architecture.
Hello everyone, this is Vikram Prakash and you are yet once again listening to Architecture Talk. Each episode we always try and advance the frontier of the ways of thinking architecture, of architectural thinking itself and its implications for the wider world. Always our goal is to find a new way, a new perspective on what architecture is today and what it could be tomorrow. And that is certainly the case with my conversation today with Daniel Barber, who, along with his teammates Rachel Lee, Ola Uduku, Ian Jackson, and Jiethui Chang, has prepared a fantastic module on global history and climate for the GAHTC. And although the module itself, with its 6 lectures, focuses on the colonial and modern and recent history of the implications of climate on architectural thinking globally, our discussion today starts with that, weaves its way through the various lectures and modules, but then ends up in a far-ranging discussion on climate and climate-related architectural thinking today. Some interesting neologisms there. I hope you enjoy it, and please do let me know if it was instructive. Here we go. So welcome to Architecture Talk, Daniel. Thank you for being here. And I have in front of me your fantastic module on climate in the colonial and modern period and its extremely complicated relationship with colonialism, global thinking, and certainly how modernism is implicated in it.
Yeah.
So there are 6 lectures, and I see that you and your team have organized the lectures by themes, an introduction, looking at sort of the colonial conditions in Africa and Asia, kind of the imperative, obviously, to sanitation and climate as it connects in particular, of course, to the British Empire. Some ideas about how modernism picks this up, focusing in particular on the example of Königsberger and other German architects, and then kind of the sort of post-war modernism, particularly in Brazil, around the influence of, let's say, Le Corbusier, and concluding then in the 6th lecture with the, of course, counter-propositional vexing question of air conditioning.
Indeed.
So this is a great discussion. Now, you start off in lecture 1, you introduce the whole topic, you and your team, by connecting this question of climate and colonial and modern architecture to connecting and distinguishing your discussion, I suppose, with a kind of, I would say, Orientalist reading of native cultures and settlements as kind of the architecture of the other, if you like. So can you tell us a little bit about this discussion of climate and architecture? How does it and does it not connect to this kind of idea of climate-driven architecture as the architecture of native cultures or Oriental cultures?
Sure. Yeah, no, it's a good place to start. And looking through the material again, myself really struck by the kind of richness of what the team was able to put together. On those terms. I think one of the things that we struggle with today in framing the question of climate and architecture, framing this relationship as a sort of set of historical thematics, is the extent to which um, a sort of relationship to climate is so intricately embedded in
Hmm.
design strategies, right? Sort of up to the modern period. I mean, there's certainly a shift. We could say kind of mid 19th, early 20th century, which we can get to, but which is to say that so-called vernacular or traditional practices engage with local materials, with relationships to the sort of specific climatic aspects of their regions, in a sort of anti-universalist way, right? I mean, which is to say,
Hmm.
um, a very locally or regionally focused approach, right? So I think
You're
that
talking today or in the like 19th, early
no,
20th?
I'm thinking, back in, I mean, where the module starts in the sort of timelessness of these sort of models. I mean, in effect, part of what's on the table to in that sort of broad historical stretch is to recognize that modernism, I mean, the sort of more recent past of the 100 or so years, was a real break from an architecture that was always sort of, if not necessarily interested in climate per se,
Hmm.
was located in its specific condition, responding to a given set of climatic conditions, and was sort of, because of where it was built, had some relationship to its climatic surround, right? So
Yeah.
um, what Al Narath is playing out in this first module is a real interesting sort of analysis of a number of different cultural forms, right, that articulate in effect these sort of varied vocabulary of relations to climate, of sort of how different building strategies, through the thickness of walls, through the raising up from the ground, through the kind of precise composition of the roof, right, were developed in direct relationship to what we now think of as sort of a set of regional climatic imperatives, right?
So are you arguing in that with those two examples that you have of the Pueblo Indians and the other one that these kind of, uh, for lack of a better term, pre-modern or
Yeah.
pre-westernized, colonial modern westernized technologies of building were organically climatic?
I hesitate to agree wholeheartedly. Just I think there's a concern there of a kind of romanticization of a kind of time of being at one with nature and this sort of thing, right? But I think that it is certainly the case that one can identify strategies. Uh, well, strategies is maybe not the right word, but one can post hoc analyze, say, the production of Adobe in a Pueblo context,
Hmm. Hmm.
and recognize that the thickness of those walls had a profound climatic set of effects, right?
Yeah.
And that the practitioners engaged in those building practices, whether there was a sort of consciousness of managing a certain set of climatic challenges, or whether it was just a set of traditions that were passed down, developed in relationship to the climate that surrounds them, right? Which is in a sense, and one sees this, or I'm sort of framing this, I guess, as a sort of contrast to the sort of universalist premise of the modern movement, so to speak, right? The
Right.
internationalness,
Absolutely. Yeah.
which is, again, not to sort of collapse into some sort of romantic sort of nostalgia, but to recognize that even today, and again today, I should say, in many cases, the sort of return to a relationship to regional materials, or sort of forms, or building practices of the past, that recognize that there was a certain efficacy relative to how a building would sort of engage its climatic conditions, right?
And even beyond that, like you give the example, for instance, of the connection of Taos Pueblo to Blue Lake, and
Mm,
how that the architecture of a building or even of a community connected to a
mhm.
broader ecology
Right, right,
is the
right.
kind of thinking that is certainly coming back today.
Indeed, yeah.
One can find the roots of a lot of contemporary ecological thinking in uh, uh, older ways of
Sure.
building.
Sure. Well, right, and I think that part of what's interesting, I mean, just in this specific piece of the module in particular, Al Narath's set of slides and discussions, as because part of what Al's doing in a different context is looking at how uh, in the 1940s and 50s and beyond there was a sort of scientific interest in the thermal capacities of Adobe, for example, right?
Right.
Which is to say that when we understand these traditions today and seek to apply them or engage with them in specific ways in a set of building practices, it's with a very different set of intellectual frameworks for kind of understanding, performativity, right, and kind
Right.
of
Right.
understanding
Right.
how these specific materials operate. Al tells the story of Los Alamos nuclear engineers who, spent their free time developing sensing mechanisms to understand in very precise terms the thermal capacities of an Adobe brick, right,
Mhm.
and in part it's a question of how do we integrate those new conditions of technical knowledge into our building practices as well, right?
I mean, one of the things that occurs to me is that perhaps one of the questions I have for contemporary ecological thinking is the high
Mm,
degree of tech integration of technology and
yep,
scientific data
yep,
driven thinking that
yep.
it is driven by, versus, I suppose, what you were starting to describe would be a kind of a narrative based, more uh, uh, culturally
Hmm.
uh, uh, imaginative
Hmm. Hmm.
relationship to a climatic way of living.
Yeah,
I mean,
yeah, yeah, yeah,
are
yeah.
there some sort of what do you think about that? I mean, do you think?
So I think, yeah, I think you've touched on really the sort of crux of the matter. I mean, shifting our discussion a bit to the sort of challenges of the present,
Right.
that that while we have developed, I mean, uh, by which I mean, the sort of general approach to kind of architectural scholarship and knowledge, have developed a very elaborate and sophisticated capacity to, to measure a building's performance, to kind of understand the way a certain material or a certain glass panel operates,
Right.
in a given context, et cetera. Um, uh, the intensity of this kind of applications of this scientific knowledge to building practices, we know now exactly how much carbon given building is emitting into the air,
Right.
but have a bit less of a capacity to really rethink how those practices might transform. So, I mean, I often think of the passive house, right? For example, the sort of, one can be certified as a passive house designer and be producing these very heavily insulated,
Mhm.
often panelized and very high embodied energy
Right.
building projects that certainly perform well in terms of the kind of maintenance of a certain type of thermal interior,
Mhm.
that have extensive upfront costs, not only economically but ecologically, right? In terms of the sorts of
Correct.
materials being used, and precisely what you just identified, which is one of the things that the study of architecture and climate historically helps us to see is that climate is in effect a realm for cultural interaction, right? I mean that we sort of live differently and according to different climatic conditions. We operate with, so in terms of sociability, in terms of certain types of collectives, and we sort of see our lives on slightly different terms. And I think that what we begin to recognize is that the struggle to adjust to reduce carbon emissions, right, is as
Mhm.
much a struggle of changing behaviors, of thinking about what we are as a society in different ways, of sort of trying to reimagine ways of life that that on the one hand in very sort of pragmatic ways might involve wearing sweaters when you're inside in the winter,
Right.
right, and
Right.
keeping the heat turned down, or God forbid, wearing fewer clothes in the summer when you're at work or something, something of that nature,
Mhm.
which is to say some form of behavioral adaptation that mitigates or in some way, attempts to minimize our reliance upon these mechanical systems.
Right. Right. I mean, it seems to me the main narrative that drives contemporary ecological thinking is a kind of a pre-apocalyptic fear that if we don't do this, then judgment will be at hand, and we are all going to
Yeah.
go up in carbon smoke.
Yeah.
So we'd better do something.
Well,
But
I mean,
what
yeah.
is do sort of producing narratives that are more affirmative? I mean, I don't know.
Right,
Yeah.
right. No, indeed. No, I mean, and I think that on some level, the sort of the climate, the social struggle of the climate crisis is a very familiar one, right? I mean,
Right.
how do we attend to other voices? How do we increase conditions of equity, across urban and national and international conditions? Which is to say, the project is to dislodge the sort of profit motive from overwhelming our ways of life, right? And that now has a certain set of characteristics vis-a-vis different, imagining different ways of living within existing structures, within the built environment as it stands, as well as, of course, imagining complete sort of transformation to the built environment.
Mhm.
And I think I think there is, there is a sort of I don't know, I guess I like to use the term apocalyptimist, right? I mean, I think I, I ascribe.
I like it. Yeah,
Yeah, it's
apocalypse.
a good one, right? I ascribe somewhat to this sort of, especially given the IPCC report of now 2 or 3 weeks ago, effectively saying, things are even worse than we thought.
Right.
There is a certain pressure, right? A certain sort
Sure.
of crisis that's increasingly present. And I don't, and I do think, many people will suffer, right? And I mean, not that suffering wouldn't have happened anyway, but in a specific way. And that the index of that suffering is geographic, is economic, is sociocultural, right? As much as it is sort of climatic, right? Which is to say, it has a lot to do with the kind of capacities one has to move around and to sort of open up other opportunities. But at the same time, I think there's certainly a need to, and in fact, architecture, I think, has a profound role to play here, of recognizing that while we're facing great challenges, right, that we have the capacity, the in terms of technological innovation, right, in terms of everything from seeding clouds to completely transforming the built environment, but also in terms of how we relate, right, to ourselves as individuals and social beings, right, we have a capacity to move through this process, right, to move through these challenges and into a presumably quite different global condition, right? I mean, again, both sort of
Right.
in terms of territory, but also in terms of forms of social relations, right? That,
And imaginations. I mean, when I try and
indeed,
I'm
yeah,
trying to rack my head for contemporary apocalyptimist social imaginaries.
yeah,
And the thing that jumps straight into my head, since I'm on the West Coast, is
sure,
I suppose Elon Musk.
yeah,
Here is a man who's trying to fire open an imagination about, amazing electric cars,
right,
batteries, and
right.
even, journeys to Mars as kind of a apocalyptimist. What is your sense of? And the other thing that comes to my mind is Mad Max Fury Road.
Yeah, sure. The other option. Yeah, no, indeed. No, but I think, Musk is an interesting figure to sort of isolate in this context, because I think there's, it's such a, the sort of long history of the kind of fantasy of the technological fix, right? I mean,
Yeah.
so much of the discourse around, climate in our contemporary context, is sort of wolf, the sort of, we have a history of technological innovation that will help us to solve this problem, right? I mean, that we don't know what it's going to be yet. Maybe it's kind of things that eat carbon, or maybe it's, again, seeding clouds, or some of these seemingly fantastical, or maybe we all move to Mars, right? But the technology will find a way, and all we have to do is continue to fund that research. And this is kind of the architectural approach, right? And it's framed in a, I mean, not just, I mean, that's way too general, but in terms of a sort of general question of green design or sustainable design, it's basically like, get the engineers on board and so
Yeah.
on.
The technology is still only seen in a completely modernist way as the only
Yeah,
solution and only
yeah,
pathway for
right,
architecture.
right.
In this-
So, I mean, what I think would be, where I think Musk would, I think if Musk were really, able to have an impact, he would be talking about, not electric cars, but electric buses, right? Or, I mean, some way, I mean, we have, one of the things we have to dislodge is this notion that my own individual satisfaction is, above and beyond that of the collective, right? I mean, again, this is the kind of age-old issue that this climate crisis just sort of puts back in our face, right?
So who's our interesting alt models for a
Apocalyptimistic approach, yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
In architecture, let's switch to
In
architecture
architecture,
today.
sure.
I mean, architecture broadly defined, obviously, ecologically, landscape.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. Well, I think there's I mean, I often think of Kate Orff, right, and the oyster texture, which
Oyster texture. Yes, in New York.
I have some problems with in some ways, but I think is a sort of general framework, right, that is to say that we can completely reimagine the what I like to refer to as the socio-biotic relationship, right? I mean, if we transform the ecosystem, and that also transforms the way that we live in relationship to it, right? That this provides unexpected opportunities, not for some, again, kind of technological determinist fantasy in which everybody's kind of always interconnected in some way, but rather for a sort of different way of living with the environment, right? That this notion that in some of the versions of her images and the way she plays it out, that you sort of go and harvest some oysters when you're hungry, right? I mean, you have a completely different kind of
relationship
capacity to understand how these environmental aspects of the world that surrounds you impact the way that you live, right? Because part of the legacy of the modernist sort of imperative in the built environment is that we isolate ourselves when we're in buildings, right? I mean, generally speaking, and certainly in a sort of institutional context. I mean, I always open my window in my office and all year round because it's either too hot or too cold, based on somebody else that's setting the temperature at some central bureau, right? We live in a situation where we don't have to sort of accommodate ourselves, except for the kind of walk to the bus or the subway or the car park, to the environment outside, and that defines a certain relationship between culture and nature, right? Between humans and their environmental surround that has made it very difficult to engage this challenge, right? Because we've kind of lost the tools and the language, even in architecture, I would say. I think we've been struggling, and I think this module represents some of that struggle, right? I think we've been struggling to develop a discourse that helps us to understand, kind of what happened in the modern period that isolated us from these natural patterns. And again, not to sort of collapse into some, back to the land, let's all sort of live with nature, but to try to think creatively about how we can now use technology to transform those relationships and kind of rescript this condition of this kind of sociobiotic forms of interaction. I think also of David Benjamin's work, an architect based at Columbia University, right, who's done a lot of, very direct sort of, he has a project where you are sort of able to kind of talk to the fishes in the East River. He has another project where the building is built up through a set of bricks built out of mushrooms, right, or sort of emerging out of a kind of fungal process, right? And all of them are partial, all of them are kind of inadequate on their own, as kind of standalone projects, but indicate that there's other sorts of relationships, other sorts of processes that we can engage in.
Yeah, I mean, that sounds. It's also connects in some ways, I guess, to these ideas of new materialism, where one has to redefine this idea of what it means to talk to the fishes, or talk to mushrooms, or talk to the brick,
right? No, indeed,
concrete, to develop a more actively agential, symbiotic relationship. But before we get completely out there. Let's turn back to some of the other lectures in your module.
Sure. Yeah.
And in particular, I'm looking here at the outline of lecture 4 on the sort of the German story around modernism, which follows the path. I think Rachel Lee put this one together.
Yes, she did, indeed.
On how how the Jewish diaspora out of Germany resulted in architects traveling all over the world, which included, of course, Otto Königsberger, who was, I guess, first in Egypt, then recovering from some kind of consumption in Switzerland, and then eventually in India.
Right.
during the war before returning back to London around, I think, 1951 or 52,
Yep.
something there.
Yep. Something like that.
So I have a few thoughts around this. I mean,
Yeah.
first, this journey of Otto Königsberger uh, and his deep interest in ideas of tropical modernism or just tropical architecture, uh, which results in this course at the AA, which then Maxwell Fry and Jane Rue are participant and active in also.
Mhm.
Uh, uh, so this whole modernist concept of tropical modernism,
Mhm.
I couldn't quite figure out from the lecture, and I'm just interested in your thoughts on it.
Sure. Sure.
Uh, i- i- do you think about this as a damning modernist
Mm.
concept, or is it
Mm.
actually in some ways early ecological modern thinking,
Right.
contemporary thinking? What is
Right.
your
Right.
thinking about the legacy of tropical modernism as this
Yeah.
discipline?
Interesting. Yeah. Um, it's a very interesting question, and in some ways, Rachel, of course, would be more prepared to kind of address the
Of course,
Königsberger question directly, but I think that uh, I mean, the sort of story goes, and this is uh, documented in the 1952 conference on tropical architecture that took place at the AA, that a lot of students, in the midst, precisely at the sort of moment of the post colony, right? I mean, just as a number of the colonies, British and colonies in West Africa, were attaining or striving at least for independence, and many students nonetheless involved in a sort of circle of influence, a cycle, sorry, of influence that brought them to the AA and often then back to Africa as practitioners.
right.
And the story goes that one of those students was sitting in a class in London and said, I don't really need to learn about snow loads, right? That there's other concerns to the architecture where I anticipate practicing that are not being addressed in terms of
Uh-huh.
in terms of heat and humidity, and in terms of the encroachment of various insects and animals, and in terms of sort of screening out and sort of producing other sorts of conditions for the interior. So on the one hand, and I think it's important though to remember, right? I mean, this is also, as you know very well, right, in the sort of moment of design in Chandigarh, and this sort of moment when architecture, when modern architects in particular were starting to test out ideas in climates that were not native to them, shall we say, right? I mean, in
Right.
which how does this sort of modern premise work in India? I mean, other stories in Brazil, certainly in West Africa, and so part of what becomes clear is that on the one hand, this capacity to almost kind of inflect the purported universalism of the modernist project according to a climatic region, was essential to its international dissemination, right?
Mhm.
Which is to say, if these, I mean, I'm thinking in particular, I mean, in effect, jumping around in these modules a little bit, but when to look at, for example, the proliferation of shading devices being used in Brazil in the 1930s and 40s,
Right. Which is
that were
fire, right?
which is that exactly, which were necessary to kind of conceptualizing and then constructing these relatively high rise, 8 to sort of 15-story towers
Mhm.
in Rio and Sao Paulo and Salvador and Recife. The shading system was essential to sort of modulating those thermal interiors, to not so much to make them livable, right? I mean, that already brings in a sort of set of specific regional parameters, right? But to make them, to enter them into some sort of global flow of knowledge, right? I mean, Peter Sloterdijk, however compromised so much of his thinking is, uses this term, the world interior of capital, right? And this sort of notion that there, we can think about comfort zones and
Mhm.
ASHRAE regulations that sort of stipulate, right, a certain temperature and humidity condition for maximizing productivity. But it's to say that this sort of design capacity to produce a certain type of thermal interior was seen as essential to the modernization of these economies and
Right.
political systems, right? And I mean, this is very evident in Chandigarh, of course, and
Of course.
also in the
Brazil.
Ministry of Education and Health in Brazil, right? I mean, even in the name of that government agency, right? That's about education and health. It's about a
yeah.
certain type of care of the population,
Mhm.
and required, in effect, these shading systems to play that out. So I think that the sort of tropical moment, or the sort of shaded modernism, right, of the 40s and 50s, that to some extent fell away when when air conditioning became more readily available and affordable. But was, it kind of was modernism initially, right? I mean, one would have to have some sort of bird's eye view on the world to play this out more clearly. But, a lot of the built work that was preceded according to a modernist idiom up until World War II and the kind of decade or so after was in some fashion shaded, right? Was in some fashion modulated by a set of climatic considerations, so as to be viable, right, as a certain type of interior space. And of course, there's numerous exceptions, but
Right. No, but let me see if I'm hearing you correctly over here. Are you
please.
arguing that this idea of international climatic modernism, as for instance in Chandigarh, Brazil, and other parts, uh, insisted on, even though working passively, insisted on a idea of a ideal uh, atmospheric condition in the interior, which
Mm-hmm.
was
Mm-hmm.
therefore uh, preliminary to the idea of to the success of the HVAC that came afterwards. Is that what?
Precisely.
Yeah.
Precisely. Yes. I mean, that
But what
even,
is
in
the
fact,
difference, though? I mean, there is
sorry.
obviously a critical difference between those two systems,
Hmm.
or does one lead directly into that?
But you mean the systems of say the shaded version or the HVAC version, right?
Fitted version
Yeah.
to the HVAC.
Yeah. No, these are totally different approaches, right? And I mean, again, some of the story. I mean, Le Corbusier. I think it was in Buenos Aires in around 1936, giving a lecture and calling for a future in which all buildings would be 68 degrees, right? And
Mhm.
in the context of a number of sort of in effect failed attempts that he was involved in that right around that time to use. I mean, I hesitate to call them air conditioning systems, but what he was attempting to do was to develop systems of modulating the thermal conditions of the interior.
Right.
They were poorly conceived, right, and they
Yeah.
didn't work. But it's not. I'm not sort of pointing fingers, but just to say it was an early attempt, right?
Right.
That didn't really play out, but that was allowed for this sort of premise to emerge that said, how can we? I mean, Ken Frampton sort of tells this story in which he's talking about the Salvation Army building in Paris, built in 28, right, by Le Corbusier.
Yeah, that's right.
In,
Yeah.
in this attempt to build what he referred to as a neutralizing wall, right, that was again a sort of misconceived approach
Right.
to a sort of insulating plenum that would condition the interior. And Frampton then refers to this as, I might be slightly misquoting, but Le Corbusier lost his faith in the manifest destiny, right, of the kind of technological project of modernism, right? I mean, this sort of notion that this was a confrontation that said we can't quite do this, right? We have to find other terms. And then Frampton then describes, the sort of invention, so to speak, of the brise soleil on Le Corbusier's in Le Corbusier's work right at that moment. So again, it's to say on the one hand that so two sort of points, right, that I'm trying to emphasize. I mean, one is that the role of that sort of control of the thermal conditions of the interior was essential to the articulation of modern architecture in this kind of interwar heroic period, right?
Mhm.
And also in its kind of effects as it disseminated in various forms around the world soon after, right? So we see shaded buildings by SOM in New Orleans being built in 1947, right? We see, shaded buildings in Los Angeles, in Australia,
Right.
and I mean,
Right.
Japan, I mean, et cetera, et cetera.
Right.
So that's on the one hand, but on the other hand, exactly as you're suggesting, right, that what ended up happening was, and there's a kind of second aspect of the story that has to do with the kind of interaction with climate scientists, that as architects, well, in effect, the capacity to conceptualize the thermal interior, right, what came to be called the comfort zone, was developed through non-mechanical means, right? Was developed through thinking about materials and spatial, volumes and
Mhm.
shading systems
Climatic
as a
grids
means.
and so on. Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And that once that had been sort of clarified on those terms, once HVAC came into play, that same sort of comfort zone was, I mean, to be a little too schematic, but was in effect
Sure,
sort of
sure.
co-opted by ASHRAE,
Right.
right, as a means to establish a set of standards that then would be
Right.
developed through, of course, mechanical
Right.
systems. Right?
Well, this might be a good time for us to take a break. We are talking to
Okay.
Daniel Barber, and we are discussing his GAHTC module done with his team. We'll be right back. Hello, everyone. Thanks for listening to Architecture Talk. This is a self-supported podcast based on an initial grant from the GAHTC. For more information about GAHTC, please visit gahtc.org. We release a new conversation every other Wednesday. So, if you're enjoying this conversation, please do be sure to visit our website and to check out some of the earlier conversations. From the website, you can also subscribe to this podcast and you can listen to the other episodes. You can also simply directly subscribe to us via Spotify or via the podcast app on your iPhone. And of course, we are available to be heard via any of the other podcasting apps that are available on the internet, such as Stitcher, Overcast, etc. We would also love to hear from you if you have any questions or just some comments, or even have a suggestion for a future episode. You can reach us via the contacts page on architecturetalk.org. Thank you for listening again. Welcome back. We are talking to Daniel Barber and we are discussing his GAHTC module. Daniel, so we've talked a little bit about the modernists and we've talked about tropical modernism. But during the break, you and I were talking about gin and tonics, and that, of course, reminded me that let's talk a little bit more about the colonial underpinning
Yes, indeed.
of these ideas of tropical modernism, or sort of
Sure.
modernizing vernaculars, I suppose, or I mean. In lecture 2 in particular, but also scattered through some of the other lectures, you and your team discuss, colonial modernism as a kind of a climatic type is a category that seems to be current in at least in academic discourses in some parts of the world. In particular, in its climatic variants.
Right.
Through the work of institutions such like as the public works departments and basic colonial building types.
Right.
How do you position the colonial in this discourse? Is it simply preliminary to modernism, or is it to be differentiated from it?
Right. No, again, it's a great set of questions. And I think that, I spend a little too much time, I think, sort of imagining what the architectural history of the future will look like, right? Which is to say 50 years from now.
Right.
What will the sort of contours of the, history of the past 200 years look like? And not that, the colonial doesn't have the questions about the colonial period, the colonial process, certainly the sort of post-colonial process are very present in our field today, but I think that will just increase and increase as time goes on, because one of the things that we really learn through again sort of taking this climatic lens, right, or that so many of the interventions and innovations of colonial building practices, I should say in particular, were about, on the one hand, adjusting again the kind of thermal interior in specific ways to make them more amenable to the sort of northern or western occupant, right? So
Right.
the British soldier and the specific the specific forms and materials and overhangs and verandas, right, that became seen as kind of necessary to a certain way of life in the colonies, and also to sort of acclimatizing the subject in very specific ways, right? The colonial subject, I should say, right? I mean, both, which is, it's in part to say that in the late 19th century, early 20th century discourse, right? I mean, the question of climate was heavily politicized and racialized, right? And even kind of a cipher for race, and so many of there's this sort of famous set of drawings, of course, from this period where where the world is sort of divided not only into climatic zones, but sort of, kind of the good, the bad, and the ugly, right? And sort of, identifying that the Northern European and basically kind of Chicago and New York, right, had the ideal climate for intellectual productivity, and everybody else was sort of trying to keep up, right? And it's evident, it's apparent, it's kind of glaringly apparent to us today that these were heavily ideological prescriptions. But this sort of notion of climate determinism, as it's often called, that the was widespread, right? And that we know these from other sorts of versions of these stories of the natives are lazy, the natives are not don't work as well as unless you sort of give them a certain set of conditions, right? This kind of notion that there was some sort of challenge that was to the challenge of sort of civilizing indigenous populations had to do with the kind of essential conditions of their climate, and of course part of that is just a recognition that to kind of paint a scenario where a British colonial agent would appear in India or Malaysia, wherever the case may be, and be uncomfortable, right, and sort of feel lazier themselves, right, and have a physiological reaction to a given set of climatic conditions that was alien in a sense, right? That felt disruptive and that became a challenge to sort of transform. So again, it's a recognition that part of the function of the built production of the colonial powers was to render those interiors, climatically distinct from the conditions of the exterior, right? And both Ian Jackson's module,
right,
to some extent Rachel Lee's, but as you were mentioning, Ola Aduku's, really playing this out in some precise terms, and relating this, of course, also to questions of sanitation and cleanliness and sort of transformations to the urban environment more generally, but recognizing how crucial this sort of negotiation with climate was to these building practices, and of course that comes to be, back to the kind of Königsberger moment, or the sort of the kind of post-war period, or well, I should say kind of 30s to 60s, kind of around the mid-century period, when the British began to establish a number of experimental stations, right, to kind of explore different climatic possibilities, right, and developing manuals for how to build in these environments, right, and some of those manuals for the British, right, and some of those manuals for their subjects, right, to say kind of here's how you can build a village that's more appropriate to its climatic condition, here's the materials one can use, etc. So it's again just to indicate that this sort of the climate becomes a sort of cipher for the sort of project of I put this in heavy scare quotes, right, the kind of civilizing project of the colonial period, as a means to sort of adjust the climate or sort of adapt the individuals to a different sort of climatic experience, right, that would help to make them more amenable to, right, the kind of Western world in some often ineffable way.
So there's the colonial beginnings of this project, which then gets amplified, transformed, and supposedly universalized through the modernist project and its scientifism. And if we take this trajectory and start looking at our what was it, apocalyptimistic perspective, how do we culturalize this internationally in a global frame, in a non-racialized, non-universalized way? What is the psychogeography that one can inhabit or travel on, I suppose, to well, not proselytize it, but to actuate it, or bring agency in a contemporary way? What is your thinking about? How would you teach a contemporary course on tropical modernism or tropical
post-apocalyptic tropicality?
Optimism, yeah.
Tropicopocalyptic optimism, something like that.
Yeah, something like that.
We might want to leave that alone. But I think that I mean, in some ways, it shifts. We can kind of use a somewhat different kind of language maybe to address some of this, which is just surrounding this question of comfort, right?
Okay.
And which is to say that, I mean, and I'm thinking in particular of an essay that Thomas Maldonado wrote in, I think it was about 78, called The Idea of Comfort. And, it feels very dated now, but it's basically a sort of proposal that, part of the project of modern architecture was to kind of expand this question of comfort, and that, and recognizing again that, that's about a set of, well, there are winners and losers in that approach, right? And which is to say that, as with other aspects of the working of capital, right? If one person is comfortable, it's, something is being expended or exploited or in some way poorly treated in order to sort of render that possible. And so, part of what I think, I mean, I'm going to come back to something a little more precise in a moment, but, part of what that helps us to recognize, right, is that, when we are comfortable in our thermally optimized spaces, we know that has dramatic detrimental effects on the global climate, right? So as much as we could also play that out in terms of labor and in terms of race and class and some of these other issues, but there's a number of great discussions going on these days about the end of cheap labor, the end of cheap nature, right? I mean, this kind of notion that, I mean, well, let me back up a little bit. So one thing to keep in mind is that the kind of modern architecture of the 50s and 60s, in the US in particular, but in many ways in other parts of the world as well, the project was almost to use as much energy as possible, right? I mean, it was energy was, I mean, I was looking in particular at the Pietro Belluschi's Equitable building, completed, I think, in 1947 in Portland, Oregon, widely seen as the first kind of sealed, fully air-conditioned office building to be built in the United States, if not the world. And documents, in the kind of discussion of that project that, how can we use more electricity, right? I mean, electricity, the use of energy being seen as an engine for economic growth, as sort of fulfilling us, pursuing the national interest. And so, let's seal it up and let's put as many air conditioners as we can afford and, kind of draw as much from, in that case, and of course, hydroelectric energy in the Pacific Northwest, right? But to sort of increase the kind of economic activity of the region, right? So, and I won't get into the implications of that as we move to the kind of the Lever House and the Seagram's Tower and some of the better known projects, but just to recognize them as intensifiers of energy use, right? So in a sense, the kind of first imperative to thinking about the kind of apocalyptic designs of the present and near future, how to design for discomfort, right? How can one sort of see the regulations that ASHRAE presents and the conditions of the thermal interior that are optimized and adjust them so as to emit less carbon as just sort of a basic principle, right? And I don't, I would say I don't know how to design for discomfort, right? I mean, when you're saying the sort of course that might play out,
as an imagination.
Yeah, no, indeed. I mean, this is maybe some some studio perhaps of, and it's not just and of course it's uneven geographically, right? I mean, I think that in the same way that when we watching some of the IPCC discussions about how many degrees Celsius can we sort of manage as a planet, right? I mean, this is some places will be flooded earlier than others, right? And refrigeration is crucial to the prospect of longevity and health, and we should we're not necessarily how to articulate in a kind of fine-grained way to recognize the unevenness of the distribution of capital as it has played out over the previous couple of centuries, and those who have benefited and not from those distributions. And so it's not to say that I think one of the typical debates around climate change is how does somebody from Paris and New York sort of go to individuals in other parts of the world, generally speaking the global south, and say sorry, we don't have any room for more carbon, so you can't have a car, you can't have a refrigerator, none of these things will be available to these emerging cultures. So it's to say that part of it is to kind of begin to articulate a kind of role for the global north, if you will, to speak a bit too generally, that that says, what can we collectively do as designers, as occupants of buildings, to kind of live at the edge of discomfort, right? We don't want to necessarily shorten our lifespan, right? Although, in pure carbon
Not
terms,
too
that
bad,
might not be a bad idea, but we want to sort of develop a means to adjust ourselves, our physiology, our wardrobe, our relationship to these systems, so as to kind of relate to them in very specific ways and kind of reduce our reliance, right, upon those HVAC systems as soon as possible, right? I mean, this is something that
So
is kind
indeed,
of
one of
happening
the
every
things it
day.
suggests is one of my favorite topics is the relationship between fashion and architecture. And you have
Yeah, great.
many times alluded to this basic fact that if we were
Yeah,
more into fashion and wearing
yeah,
sweaters and taking
yeah,
shirts off and on and thinking about the materials of our shirts and our
yeah,
jackets,
yeah.
we could significantly do better architecture.
Sure, indeed. I think so. I think so.
And
Yeah, no, it's to rely upon, and one of the things that I look at in some of the work from the 30s are the kind of proliferation of different ways that an individual would be sort of encouraged or expected to manipulate the shading facade, right? I mean, in the morning you go in and you move the lever one way, and then around noon you shift it again, and then maybe when the sun starts to poke in, you draw a certain blind and open up a different sort of ventilation system in some fashion, right? That there's a sort of interaction with the body that gets involved, right? And that extends indeed to fashion, to bathing habits, to eating habits, to all sorts of ways that if it's just a question as if we imagine, if we recognize, I should say, we don't have to imagine, if we recognize that the production of additional carbon in the atmosphere is detrimental to our lives and the lives of our children and grandchildren,
Mhm.
how do you operate differently within, in your daily life? It's not just, but it's a little tricky, right? Because we don't want to collapse into, oh, if I take a shorter shower, I'm solving climate change, right? I mean,
That's sort of
the conditions are structural, right? The conditions are not personal. But what architecture has the capacity to do is sort of mediate between those kind of structural, large scale, let's call them infrastructural conditions of energy use and supply, and the kind of experience of the individual within a given space or environment, right? So it's really, my sort of the
That's
current,
intriguing. Mediation, architecture is the
yes, indeed,
mediation
yeah,
between the large structural and the personal.
yeah,
Talk,
indeed,
talk, talk. Before we end here, why don't you try? Let's flesh that out a little bit more. And
hmm.
mediate, and what do you mean by architecture over here? A few
Sure,
minutes ago, we were including fashion in architecture.
yeah,
Is
yeah,
that what
yeah.
you mean, or what does mediation mean over here?
Sure. Well, I think it means two things, right? I mean, I think that on the one hand, we think of mediation in the sense of a sort of realm of cultural discourse, right? Which is to say that, to go back to some of these shaded examples from the 30s and 40s, the presence of a given facade in an urban environment, that we can read these facades as kind of evidence of a certain relationship between interior and exterior, between culture and nature, right? But
Mhm.
kind of as evidence of this sociobiotic relationship, to use that term again. So in the one sense, that's media in terms of something that's legible on cultural terms, that can help us construct a different sense of ourselves as cultural agents, right? As sort of cultural beings, right? So which is to say, if we recognize that the way that we treat the facade, and even in one sort of domestic environment, like do you seal your house up in the summer and turn on the air conditioner, or do you turn on the fan and open all the windows, right? I mean, that's a different sort of engagement with the sort of presence of a building in its urban environment, and in the way that sort of, or suburban environment, as the case may be, and in the way that sort of has effects on the interior. But it's also media in the sense of medium, in the sense of sort of the material sort of substrate, right? The kind of um, products and structural systems and HVAC systems, which is that architecture is both the kind of media that allows us to see these different relationships to the climatic surround, and also the conditions that will build their transformation, right? I mean, we won't make it through, so to speak, these climate challenges without drastically transforming the built environment, right? I mean, this is evident. So it becomes the sort of medium for social transformation, right, on its kind of simplest terms, but maybe a bit more a bit less optimistically, the medium for contestation, right? I mean, I like to really think about the thermal interior, the air-conditioned space that, or heated space, as the case may be, as it's getting colder here in the Northeast, as a kind of space of politics, right? I mean, as a space of where we are having debates about how to live and what our values are, right? I mean, this is playing out in terms of the thermostat, right? In terms of the way that we kind of experience and inhabit these interiors. And so part of what I've been trying to do in my teaching to architecture students in particular is help them try to give students some tools to kind of recognize the political, the kind of intensity of that space as a political space, and so how to kind of take the decisions that are made around it very seriously, right?
All right, all right.
Yeah.
Well, we learn to try and live a bit more uncomfortably and see architecture as the production of discomfort. This is what we have learned from you. Thank you so much for being on Architecture
It's a
Talk.
pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you for listening to Architecture Talk. This is Vikram Prakash, your host, and our producer is the one and only Sammy Prouty, a graduate student of architecture here at the University of Washington in Seattle. I hope you all enjoyed our conversation, and if you did, please do take a moment to subscribe and to rate us on iTunes. See you next time. Take care. Goodbye.